Welcome to Talks in America. We have a speaker today. He's a scholar, academician. He works with sociology department in University of Rice. We have Dr. Craig Considine today.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation
It's
and
my
doing the
pleasure.
interview. Let's start with a really important question, and we can jump in the subject I like to talk with you. Integration. We did many interviews with different people based on, as a Turkish community, how we can integrate it in the US or America or any other countries. So because you research a lot about Islamophobia and anti-racism, so do you think Muslims integrated in America well?
I think they have, and the research shows that they have in terms of a lot of things. So, levels of educational attainment, Muslims have integrated. Muslims are integrated into their communities via their interfaith dialogue activities, right? So they're working with the Jewish community, the Christian community, various communities. In terms of the amount of money they make too, like it's actually above the norm for most Americans. So they've integrated in that way, but that's not necessarily the type of integration we want, right?
Okay.
So
what do you want?
We want the integration of people. So we don't want the integration of Muslims into the structure of society. We want Muslims integrating with other human beings. So the best term that I've come up with for the process of integration, another way of looking at it is pluralism, right? So energetically engaging with your neighbors, with your community members. So I came up with a term, and Gusha, you may know it, it's called DEUCE, D-E-U-C-E. So the first thing with the D is dialogue. The first thing, and this isn't just for Muslims, this is for everyone in society, because when we talk integration, it's a two-way street. Muslims can't integrate unless others are willing to allow them to integrate, and vice versa, right?
True.
So the D is for dialogue, right? We have to start talking with one another. You can't break any stereotypes down if you don't talk. It's the most fundamental thing human beings do, talking. Once you start talking, you can start educating each other, right? So that's when, once you start talking, you bring out the books. You bring out the Quran, you bring out the Bible, the Torah. You bring out the sociologists, the theologians, and all the scholars, and you sit down and you teach each other. Once, and the U is for understanding, right? Just because you educate each other doesn't mean you're really seeing eye to eye. Like you want that deep understanding, not this kind of superficial understanding. So we've had the D for dialogue, education, U for understanding. The next thing, once you have an understanding, once you're cool with someone, then you can start working with one another. So you can start committing yourselves in different communities to certain projects. So like maybe every 2 weeks we're going to have a communal dinner at the masjid or at the church. So we come together, or say during election cycles, we all come together and we hold voting registrations together because we understand each other. We understand that we're not that different. Once we've committed ourselves to certain projects and principles, then we can go out and we can engage with others. So Muslims and Christians, once we have that cohesion, once we've had the dialogue, we've educated each other, we understand one another, we commit ourselves to each other, then we can go teach other people and other Muslims and Christians who are not necessarily integrated. So, and then we can bring them into the fold. So DEUCE is also a word for two, which is a peace sign as well. So
yeah, perfect.
it's not, DEUCE is not only relevant for pluralism or integration, but also for peaceful relations between
I'm
people.
glad I learned that.
There you go, DEUCE, and it's easy to remember.
Yes, it is. It is. So can we talk, like you said, they well integrated. At least you can see the sign. You're in university. You see the young adults. So can you also tell why we should integrate if there are still some people who didn't integrate in a good level?
Right. So in American society, we have this term. It's called common sense. It goes back to the origins of this country by a man named Thomas Paine. And he said common sense was for the King of England to not tax Americans if the Americans don't have representation, which makes sense. The new common sense is not only integration and pluralism, but Muslims are living here, and they've lived here for centuries and centuries. And if you shut off from society and if you isolate yourself from society, you're not helping yourself. You're not helping your future generations, your children. So we want to find a balance in which we can integrate into American society at the same time keeping our religious beliefs, keeping our cultural traditions, keeping our traits of ethnicity. Like we want to strike that balance, but you have to find that balance. As they say, there's an old saying, when in Rome, you do as the Romans do, right? When in America, work towards the mainstream in some ways, learn English. It's important to learn English. Like how can you strive in society? How can you build a better life for your family if you're not, speaking a language? Learn to learn the ways and the culture of your neighbors. Like these are all really, really important. If you want to feel safe, if you want to feel proud, if you want to feel stable, you have to integrate too. But there's a balance. Do you know what I mean? Like other people, society at large, also has to do some certain things to allow you to come into the fold, to allow you to integrate.
They should approach it the same way.
Exactly. So it's a give and take.
Dialogue is too.
Exactly. So it's a given. Integration it doesn't just. You can't just put it on a Muslim person or someone of any faith and just say you have to integrate. It's not. You need the resources to integrate. You need to be able to get into a school. You need to be able to get into that language program to teach you English.
Yes.
So it goes both ways. The individual needs to want to be part of a society.
Mm-hmm.
Society needs to want the individual to also be part of the society. That's why the deuce is important, and it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm.
We have to find a common ground for people to interact on, really.
True. So, because you research about Islam and you're the Catholic, your religion also, can you tell us to encourage us more, like these two prophets, what they said, like why we need to love our neighbors, what they're saying?
So, fundamentally, at the heart of the prophetic traditions in Islam and Christianity, dealing specifically with Jesus and Muhammad, it's the golden rule.
Mm-hmm.
Treat others the way that you would like to be treated. And when they came and they were delivering their message, it was about 600 years apart. They weren't coming specifically for their ethnic groups, like Jesus was a Jew and Muhammad was an Arab. They weren't coming for these specific communities. They had a bigger idea in mind, and what they were really focusing on was humanity and finding ways of developing human consciousness in a way that benefited all people, And like they were not simply prophets, like they were revolutionaries. Jesus saying, love thy neighbor, and throw away the chains of the hierarchy of the rabbis. And when Jesus was when he's on the Temple Mount and he came and he brushed aside all the money of the businessmen doing their economic work in a place of worship. Those were radical ideas. And when Muhammad came, peace and blessings be upon him, he was also remarkable in a lot of ways too, because he was focusing a lot on race and tribe and ethnicity. And when he came, he said, okay, my vision of society is one that's not going to be not racist. He was saying, my society is going to be anti-racist. There's a difference. Like you could easily say, I don't think either one of us are racist. We're non-racist people. But are we anti-racist people? Are we taking active measures to combat racism? Muhammad was, when he appointed Bilal, who was an Ethiopian slave and half Arab as well. And when he appointed him to be the muezzin, the person who called the people to prayer, that was unheard of. And even some of Muhammad's closest companions used to criticize Bilal for, calling him like the son of a black woman. And Muhammad would step in and be like, that's not what I'm teaching you. That's not what I'm teaching you at all. So they both came with these radical messages for the time. I think it's common sense to see that their messages are needed for eternity. But what we see too is Christians and Muslims forgetting these principles. You know, in this country we have the far right, the Christians who are persecuting Muslims. You have Muslims in different parts of the world persecuting Christians, and the message of these prophets is getting lost. But ultimately, they stood for very, very similar things. You know, like they're kindred spirits.
I remember one of your tweets. You said our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "You shouldn't be hungry." Like, do you remember that?
Yeah,
like,
he said you're
mention
not a true believer if your neighbor goes to bed
Yes.
hungry. And think of all the stories that we find in the Gospels with Jesus,
True.
literally
True.
holding massive
True.
banquets and saying, "We
True.
don't care what part of what tribe you belong
Yeah.
to. We don't care what part of society you
Yes.
belong to. You come." And then even the way that Jesus approached the most destitute people of society, the people who were mentally suffering, people who were disabled, people who had diseases, prostitutes. Like, he brought all of these people into the fold and say, this is God's kingdom. This is what, you know, you're God's creation. You're no less valuable than anyone else. And Muhammad said the same thing. He
Learning
pretty much
about
said the
those
same
will
thing.
be really helpful to us to knock our neighbor's door. And not knowing English might be an excuse, but not a reason to knock the door, right?
Exactly.
So,
You know, and even if you can't speak English, you find a story like this and you go up to your neighbor, and you know, you can still share it, and if they read it, I think they would be able to understand, like, the offering that you're giving them and the spirit in which you come in of
Yes.
peace.
yes. So can we also talk about the two things? We like to ask you the definition of those: tolerance and embrace. So what are their definitions? Are they really same thing? How after we learn those definitions, how it will help us to integrate?
So I think they're different.
Okay.
Tolerance and embrace are definitely different.
So how?
So I'm
Listen carefully.
I'm critical of the term tolerance. I don't think it's a bad term, but
Okay.
the example that I use, you have children, right?
Yes.
I do not have children, but I hope to someday. When you tolerate a child, it's usually a toleration in the face of something that you don't necessarily like,
Yes.
that you don't want them to do, or it's something that
There
you,
are things I tolerate.
or it's something like you turn a blind eye to, you know? So tolerance is quite standoffish. Like, you could say, in a society that has tolerance, there's not a lot of violence, which is good. But if we were to create a community of tolerance, it's like, okay, the Jews go over there, the Muslims go over there,
Like
the Hindus,
cross border, huh?
yeah, the Hindus go over there and the Christians go over there. We're going to tolerate each other because everyone is allowed to exist the way they want to exist. But when things go bad, right, and these different factions of society have to come together, you don't know anything about each other.
True.
And the stereotypes and the misperceptions creep in. With embrace, it goes a step further than tolerance. So embrace automatically has intolerance because you're coming into the embrace, into the interaction with a level of understanding, or at least a wish of understanding, right? So you tolerate to that degree. But this is the difference between tolerance and embrace, tolerance and pluralism. Pluralism is the energetic engagement with the diversity. Tolerance is just a recognition of that diversity with no cross-cultural human interaction.
So, Dr. Constantine, many years I strongly believe that we should be colorblind because I thought it might be helpful to me to love every humankind. But I figured out later on, after I listened to different speeches like yours or other people, actually being able to see the color of differences, but still being able to embrace, that's the skill.
Yes, and that's embrace and that's pluralism. Like, you know, pluralism and embrace doesn't need to be this big kumbaya session where we all come together and everyone agrees on everything. Like, that's, as the Quran says, you know, we built you into tribes and nations for you to get to
Know each other.
And the Bible has a similar spirit. So it's, you know, that's our challenge as human beings. God has presented this to us, and we have to learn how to make sense of it. In terms of the colorblind thing, you know, we have to recognize where race comes in, where it's involved. So in American society, a lot of people like to say, especially when President Obama got elected, oh, like we now live in a post-racial, colorblind world. You know, black man becomes president, all the racial issues are now solved. But obviously race is deeply embedded in American society in terms of the educational opportunities we get, in terms of the criminal justice system, in terms of even things like voting, which we saw over the last couple days.
Yes.
So to say, to just say, I don't see color, I treat everyone the same, is not good. We have to treat each other differently because we're all different and we all have different circumstances that come with our identities. You know what I mean? If that makes sense.
It is. Last question. If you have a chance to give any advice to young adults, what it might be to integration? Because many of us, I don't want to say many, but I mean, we might have some teenage or some young adult again. They might be proud of their Muslim, or Turkish, or different minority group, but still it's hard in their age because they want to get accepted from the community.
Right.
So how we can motivate them?
I'd say to find like-minded people in society that are willing to embrace you for who you are. But I think more importantly, finding people that will embrace you, but also to work with you, to commit to certain projects with one
Deuce.
another. The deuce, yeah, essentially.
Yes.
But like finding ways where, you can bring your identity to the table and it's recognized, it's respected, it's appreciated without people dismissing that you're different, but also working alongside people in a collaborative manner, like holding food drives, Christians and Muslims coming together, holding food drives. Because when you engage in these projects with different communities, you're going to naturally come across a diverse range of people, and that's where the real learning happens, just simple conversations on an everyday basis with people, learning, appreciating, respecting, engaging, all of these things. They're very fundamental, it's not, I don't think it's as complicated as it needs to be. We just need more human interaction. In the social media world, we're just hiding behind our computer screens. And my advice to the youth is not to be keyboard warriors. A lot of people just sit behind the keyboard and they'll post something on Instagram or Facebook about a certain issue and say, well, I'm taking my stand. That's a keyboard warrior. You need to be on the computer, learn in the computer, but go out and implement what you see, or implement projects that will help counter the stuff that you're seeing on the social media, and doing it with people of different walks of life.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed our conversation.